My name is Chloe. I am 33 years old. I watched my husband pull my best friend closer in the dim light of our pantry while 50 guests sang happy birthday to our son in the next room. When I confronted him minutes later, he simply straightened his designer tie, locked the bedroom door, and told me to accept his affair or pack my bags because I was just a penniless housewife. He had no idea the quiet woman he was discarding actually owned 68% of his billion-dollar tech empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever smiled through a betrayal while quietly planning to destroy the person who hurt you. The singing echoed through the hallway of our Manhattan penthouse. Marcus, my brother-in-law, an African-American corporate auditor and one of the few genuinely decent people in this family, was capturing the moment on his camera while his wife Maya cheered. I left to grab the custom silver cake knife from the caterer's pantry. I pushed the heavy oak door open and froze. Julian had Vanessa pinned against the expensive marble shelving. His hands were tangled in her hair, and they were kissing with a desperate hunger that made my stomach turn. Vanessa was supposed to be my best friend. She was also the public relations director at Apex AI, the company Julian ran as chief executive officer. Julian pulled away, wiping lipstick from his mouth. He did not look guilty. He looked annoyed that I had interrupted him. I did not scream. I calmly stepped backward and pulled the heavy door shut, locking it from the outside with a sharp click. I walked straight to the master bedroom to gather my thoughts. Julian used his master key to unlock the pantry and stormed in right behind me. He slammed the door shut and locked it. Instead of a fabricated excuse, he crossed his arms and glared at me with absolute contempt. "You are making a huge deal out of nothing," he snapped. "Vanessa understands the pressure I am under. I run a tech empire, Chloe. You sit at home playing house. You contribute absolutely nothing to the bottom line of my life." I looked at the man I had married 5 years ago. He was arrogant and utterly blinded by his own inflated ego. When we first met, he was a struggling startup founder drowning in rejections. Now he strutted around acting like a self-made genius. I told him to pack his bags and leave my house. Julian laughed a harsh, ugly sound. "Your house," he mocked. "I pay the mortgage. Accept this arrangement or get out. You have absolutely nothing without my last name." The bedroom door swung open. Beatrice, my mother-in-law, marched in. She had clearly been eavesdropping. She ignored her son's blatant infidelity and turned her furious gaze directly on me. "Do not you dare raise your voice at my son on his child's birthday," Beatrice hissed. "From the moment you walked into this family with your massive student debt, Julian has had to carry you. You bring absolutely nothing to this marriage but complaints. You are a financial burden. You should be grateful he even keeps you around." Beatrice worshipped money, obsessed with country club status, and believed a wife's only duty was blind obedience. She viewed me as an inferior investment because I never flaunted designer labels or boasted about corporate titles. She wanted a trophy daughter-in-law. I looked at Beatrice, then at Julian. Vanessa had slipped into the hallway, standing just behind Beatrice with a triumphant smirk. They all thought they had me backed into a corner. They thought I was just a dependent housewife terrified of losing her meal ticket. I did not argue. Arguing was for people who lacked leverage. I walked past all three of them in silence. I went into the living room, picked up my son Leo from his high chair, grabbed my purse and walked out the front door. I did not look back. I knew Julian and Vanessa were smirking, believing they had won an easy victory. They had no idea they had just handed me the key to their total destruction. The rain hit the windows of the taxi as we sped away from the penthouse. I settled Leo into his car seat and pulled out my phone. A notification flashed across my screen. Julian's corporate card, linked to an account I quietly monitored, had just been swiped for $15,000 at a luxury jeweler. He was buying Vanessa a diamond necklace to celebrate his newfound freedom. I opened my laptop and entered my biometric credentials to access a highly secured portal. For 7 years, I had maintained a completely separate professional identity. I was not a financially dependent housewife. I was a senior manager at a top-tier venture capital fund. More importantly, I was the sole proprietor of Vanguard Holdings, a shadow corporation owning exactly 68% of Apex AI. I was the silent ghost investor who secretly bankrolled Julian's entire career. 19 minutes later, my phone began to ring. Julian's name flashed on the screen. He called once, twice, then 10 times. I watched the missed call counter climb to 74. I knew exactly what was happening back at the party. His black card had just been declined in front of the catering staff. His corporate accounts were completely frozen, rendering him powerless. I ignored his frantic calls and opened a new email to my lead corporate attorney. I typed a single sentence. Execute Clause 4. A. Initiate the $675 million capital recall from Apex AI and freeze all joint domestic accounts immediately. This targeted action would permanently sever his primary financial lifeline and legally ensure my absolute control over his deeply fragile corporate destiny forever. I watched the encrypted email disappear and closed my laptop. The taxi pulled up to the glittering hotel entrance. The doorman rushed forward to shield Leo and me from the pouring rain with a black umbrella. I bypassed the check-in line and walked straight to the VIP concierge. Within 5 minutes, I had the keys to the presidential suite secured under my maiden name. I knew perfectly well that would not keep my husband away for long. Upstairs, the suite was a haven of quiet luxury, a sharp contrast to the chaotic party I had just abandoned. I laid Leo in the crib the hotel staff provided. He was completely exhausted and fell asleep instantly. I walked over to the windows overlooking the wet, glowing streets of Manhattan. My phone vibrated endlessly against the marble countertop. Julian was bombarding me with messages. I picked up the device and scrolled through the texts. The progression of his panic was a fascinating study. The first few messages were dripping with his usual arrogance. "Come back here immediately. Stop acting like a child. You are embarrassing me in front of the board." 10 minutes later, the tone shifted. "Why is my black card declining? Unlock the joint account right now. The caterers are threatening to call the police over the unpaid invoice." He thought I had frozen our personal checking accounts in a fit of jealous rage. He had absolutely no comprehension of the financial guillotine currently descending on his entire corporate structure. I did not reply. Instead, I opened the Vanguard Holdings executive portal. The dashboard confirmed the asset freeze was fully integrated. Apex AI was officially bleeding out. My phone buzzed again. It was a text from Beatrice, my mother-in-law. "You vindictive little brat. Julian is a prominent chief executive officer, and you are humiliating him on his son's birthday. Turn his cards back on before I have my lawyers rip you to shreds." I scoffed at the screen. Beatrice lived off a trust fund subsidized by Julian's company, a company I technically owned. Her lawyers were paid with my money. She did not know it yet. I knew Julian would not stay at the penthouse. He was a narcissist losing control of his narrative and his wallet simultaneously. A year ago, he insisted we share location data on our phones, claiming it was for my safety. I left the tracking feature active on purpose tonight. I wanted him to find me. I wanted him to walk right into the trap. I walked to the mahogany desk and unclasped my leather briefcase. I pulled out a thick manila folder containing the original intellectual property transfer agreements, the unsealed Internal Revenue Service tax documents, and the detailed audit logs of Vanguard Holdings. I placed my hand flat against the cool paper. This was not a divorce file. It was an execution warrant. The phone rang sharply. I picked up the receiver. It was the front desk manager, his voice tight with panic. "Madam, a gentleman down here is claiming to be your husband. He is accompanied by an older woman and another gentleman. They are causing quite a disturbance and demanding your room number. Should I call the police?" "Do not call the police just yet," I instructed calmly. "I will come down to handle it. Send my private security detail to the lobby immediately." I had retained elite private security weeks ago, anticipating the day Vanguard Holdings would step out of the shadows. I walked to the elevator, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. I did not feel like a betrayed wife. I felt like a predator cornering its prey. When the elevator doors slid open at the lobby level, the sound of Beatrice screaming echoed across the cavernous room. She was slamming her manicured hands against the marble reception desk, demanding the staff hand over the key to my room. "She has kidnapped my grandson and stole my son's money," Beatrice shrieked at the terrified concierge. "Do you know who my son is? He runs a billion-dollar tech company. He could buy this hotel and fire all of you." Julian stood beside her, his face flushed red with rage, furiously tapping his completely useless phone. Behind them stood Marcus, Julian's brother-in-law. Marcus was a senior corporate auditor for a rival firm. He was a brilliant, meticulous man who had always viewed Julian's rapid rise with quiet suspicion. Unlike Julian and Beatrice, Marcus was not yelling. He was observing the scene with a deep, analytical frown. Julian finally looked up and saw me descending the grand staircase. Two massive security contractors in dark suits flanked me. Julian charged forward, his fists clenched, but my security stepped smoothly in front of him, creating an impenetrable human wall. Julian pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You think you can play games with me?" Julian snarled. "You think freezing my personal account scares me? I am a titan in this industry. I will bury you in court, Chloe. You will not get a single cent of my money, and I will personally take full custody of Leo. You are nothing without me." Beatrice pushed her way past Julian, her face twisted in a vicious sneer. "You ungrateful gold digger," she spat. "My son pulled you out of your pathetic middle-class life. He paid off your student loans. He put a roof over your head. You have not worked a day since you married him. You lounge around while he builds an empire. We are going to leave you penniless on the street where you truly belong." I stood perfectly still, letting their toxic, hateful words wash over me. They were loud, chaotic, and entirely wrong. The entire lobby had stopped to watch the spectacle. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a tear. I stepped forward, slipping through the gap between my security guards. I walked directly to the concierge desk, completely ignoring my screaming husband and his vicious, entitled mother. I held the heavy manila folder in my right hand. I did not look at Julian. I did not look at Beatrice. Instead, I locked my gaze onto Marcus. I slid the dossier smoothly across the cool marble counter until it rested right in front of the auditor. I tapped the cover twice with my index finger, knowing Marcus was the only person in this entire room intelligent enough to fully understand the financial slaughter that was about to unfold. I watched Julian's face turn an ugly shade of puce. He was so accustomed to my quiet compliance that my sudden defiance broke his brain. Beatrice, entirely ignoring my security detail, tried to push past them. "Get out of my way!" she shrieked at the stone-faced guards. "My grandson is upstairs with this unstable woman, and my son's money is paying for it. I want her arrested right now." I raised a hand. The guards held their line but did not touch her. I looked at Julian. He was hyperventilating, completely unhinged by the public spectacle he was causing in one of New York's most exclusive hotels. Guests were stopping to stare. The concierge was already dialing a number, presumably hotel security or the police. "You think you are so smart, Chloe," Julian sneered, his voice echoing off the marble pillars. "You froze a checking account. Big deal. Apex AI generates millions a month. I will have my lawyers drain you dry. You will never see Leo again. You will be begging me to let you back into that penthouse." Beatrice nodded vigorously. "She is nothing without you, Julian. Nothing. A pathetic nobody who struck gold and now thinks she can dictate terms." I did not respond to either of them. Instead, I shifted my focus to Marcus. He stood slightly behind Julian, his arms crossed, his eyes darting between Julian's erratic behavior and my unnerving calm. Marcus was a senior corporate auditor at a top-tier firm. He lived in the world of spreadsheets, risk assessment, and cold, hard facts. He was the only person in this family capable of seeing the freight train headed straight for them. "Marcus," I said quietly, my voice slicing through Julian's ranting, "would you care to examine the documents in this folder?" Marcus frowned, his professional curiosity overriding his familial loyalty. Julian grabbed his arm. Do not engage with her, Marcus. She is having an episode. She is trying to distract us from the fact that she kidnapped my son. I am not distracting anyone, Julian, I replied evenly. I am offering Marcus a look at reality. Because while you are screaming about a checking account, you are completely oblivious to the fact that your entire company is currently hemorrhaging cash. Julian laughed a sharp, disbelieving sound. My company is fine. Apex AI is impenetrable. I held the manila folder out toward Marcus. The Vanguard Holdings corporate charter, I said softly. The complete, unredacted financial trail of the original Series A funding for Apex AI. And the immediate execution order for the full capital recall of $675 million. Marcus stepped out of Julian's grasp and took the folder. He opened it right there in the lobby. I watched his eyes scan the first page. His analytical mind processed the information in seconds. The color drained from his face. He flipped to the second page, then the third. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer terror. Chloe Marcus whispered, This is Vanguard Holdings. Yes, I confirmed. Julian, growing impatient, snatched the folder from Marcus's hands. What is this garbage? Vanguard Holdings is our primary investor. They have nothing to do with this. Look at the signature, Julian Marcus said, his voice trembling. Look at the authorized signatory for Vanguard Holdings. Julian scanned the document. He squinted, trying to make sense of the legal jargon. Then his eyes locked onto the bottom of the page. He stared at the signature line. It was my signature. Chloe Dynamics, authorized signatory, sole proprietor, Vanguard Holdings, LLC. He looked up at me, blinking rapidly, trying to process the impossible. What is this? This is a forgery. You do not own Vanguard Holdings. They are a massive venture capital firm. I agreed. And I am the senior manager who controls it. And I am the sole proprietor of the Shadow LLC that funded your entire operation 7 years ago. You did not secure that funding because your code was brilliant, Julian. You secured it because I bailed you out. I bought your flawed code so you wouldn't face federal bankruptcy. And now I am recalling my capital. Julian stood frozen, the papers trembling in his hands. Beatrice snatched them from him, staring at the numbers without comprehending them. What does this mean? She demanded. What is she talking about? Marcus turned to Julian. His professional demeanor shattered. Julian, she didn't just freeze your personal accounts. Vanguard Holdings just triggered a total capital recall. They are pulling every cent. Apex AI will be completely insolvent in exactly 48 hours. You have no operating capital. You cannot make payroll. You cannot pay your vendors. You are bankrupt. Julian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The realization that his entire empire, his wealth, his status was entirely dependent on the woman he had just casually discarded finally crushed his arrogance. He wasn't a self-made tech titan. He was an employee. And I had just fired him. You cannot do this. Julian gasped, his voice barely a whisper. You are my wife. We are married. This is communal property. Actually, it is not, I corrected him. Vanguard Holdings was established before our marriage under an airtight, ironclad structure that explicitly protects the assets from marital division. You signed the paperwork yourself, Julian, right alongside your prenuptial agreement. You just never bothered to read the fine print or ask who actually owned Vanguard. You were too eager for the cash to care. Beatrice, finally grasping the magnitude of the situation, dropped the folder. The papers scattered across the marble floor. She looked at me with pure venom. You planned this. You set him up. You trapped my son. I did not trap him, Beatrice. I saved him, and today he gave me the perfect reason to stop. Julian, his entire world dissolving around him, suddenly snapped. He lunged at me, his face twisted in a mask of violent rage. You ungrateful, he screamed, his hands reaching for my throat. Before my security guards could even step forward, the heavy brass revolving doors of the St. Regis swung open violently. 4 uniformed police officers rushed into the lobby. They did not look at me. They walked straight toward Julian. Julian stepped back, his hands freezing in midair as the four officers surrounded him. The lead detective, a tall man with a stern expression, unclipped his heavy steel handcuffs. Julian, you are under arrest for multiple counts of corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand larceny. The detective stated, his voice carrying clearly over the dead silence of the luxury lobby. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Julian blinked, his arrogant facade completely shattering. He looked from the armed officers to his mother, then finally to me. Chloe, tell them to stop. Tell them there is a massive misunderstanding. I am a highly respected chief executive officer. I do not steal. I stepped forward, signaling my private security detail to give me a clear line of sight to my soon-to-be ex-husband. There is no misunderstanding, Julian, I replied, my voice steady and ice-cold. For the past 18 months, you have been funneling Apex AI operating capital into hidden offshore accounts. You used Vanguard Holdings investment funds to finance your luxury cars, your secret real estate purchases, and the $15,000 diamond necklace you bought your mistress exactly 1 hour ago. I did not just freeze your checking accounts today. I handed over a comprehensive 700-page forensic audit to the district attorney this very morning. Beatrice let out a high-pitched shriek. She lunged forward, grabbing the lead detective by his uniform sleeve. You cannot arrest my son. Do you know who we are? We are prominent members of Manhattan high society. My son is a tech visionary. This jealous, bitter woman is making up lies because she cannot handle that my son has finally outgrown her. Unhand him this instant, or I will personally have your badge. The detective calmly but firmly detached Beatrice's manicured hand from his arm. Madam, step back immediately, or you will be arrested for interfering with an active federal investigation. Beatrice gasped, clutching her pearls, but she took a stumbling step back. She turned her furious, tear-filled eyes on me. You have destroyed our family, she hissed, pointing a shaking finger. You have ruined the legacy we built. You are nothing but a vindictive parasite. Who is going to pay for my lifestyle now? Who is going to maintain my country club memberships and my estate? I looked at the woman who had tormented me for 5 long years. She had relentlessly mocked my clothes, my background, and my quiet demeanor. Beatrice, I said, tilting my head slightly, you do not have an estate anymore. The lavish trust fund Julian set up for you was funded entirely by the embezzled Vanguard capital. When the authorities froze Julian's assets this morning, they froze your accounts too. Your country club memberships are canceled. The mortgage on your house is in default. You are just as bankrupt as he is. Beatrice's mouth opened and closed silently. She swayed on her expensive designer heels, suddenly looking very old and very small. She looked at Julian for reassurance, but Julian was already being forced into handcuffs. The metallic click echoed sharply through the grand lobby. Marcus, who had been standing silently reading the rest of the dossier, finally spoke. His voice was low, vibrating with a cold, controlled fury. Julian, you falsified the user metrics. Julian flinched, refusing to meet his brother-in-law's gaze. Marcus, please, it was just temporary window dressing. I was going to fix the numbers next quarter. Marcus shook his head in absolute disgust. You submitted fraudulent financial reports to my auditing firm. You used my name and my professional reputation to validate your lies to the board of directors. You did not just cheat on your wife. You committed federal fraud and tried to make me an unwitting accessory. You risked my career, my license, and my freedom just to inflate your own pathetic ego. I knew Marcus would see the deeper betrayal. He was a brilliant African-American man of unyielding integrity, someone who had worked tirelessly to break through the glass ceilings of the corporate finance world. He understood exactly what Julian had done and the danger it placed him in. Marcus closed the manila folder and handed it back to me with a respectful nod. Chloe, I am sorry I ever doubted you, he said quietly. If the district attorney needs a witness to testify regarding these falsified ledgers, you have my personal number. I will not let him drag my firm down with his sinking ship. Julian thrashed against the officer's grip, his panic turning into a pathetic display of desperation. Marcus, you cannot do this. We are family. Chloe, please. I am sorry. I was stressed. Vanessa means nothing to me. She was just a distraction. Please call off the lawyers. I will do whatever you want. I will give you full custody of Leo. Just do not let them put me in a federal prison. Before I could respond, the lobby doors spun open again. Vanessa rushed in, her hair disheveled, her designer coat hastily thrown over the inappropriate dress she had worn to the party. Julian had clearly texted her before my security descended. She stopped dead in her tracks, taking in the scene. The police, the handcuffs, Beatrice weeping openly onto a velvet lobby sofa. Julian, Vanessa cried out, running toward him. What is happening? Why are your credit cards blocked? The hotel is demanding payment for the catering, and they are threatening to hold me responsible. Julian glared at her with sudden, venomous hatred. Get away from me, you idiot. This is all your fault. If you had not been so demanding, none of this would be happening. Vanessa recoiled as if she had been physically slapped. She looked at Julian, then at the police officers, and finally at me. Her triumphant smirk from the penthouse pantry was entirely gone. In its place was the terrifying realization that she had tethered her life to a sinking stone. You are the public relations director for Apex AI. Vanessa, I stated calmly, you might want to start drafting a press release immediately. The chief executive officer has been arrested for embezzlement, the company is entirely insolvent, and your position has been terminated effectively, immediately. Oh, and you will be receiving a federal subpoena next week regarding the stolen company funds used to purchase your jewelry. I suggest you find a very good defense attorney. Vanessa staggered backward, her face turning chalk white. She looked down at the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone, suddenly realizing it was not a glamorous gift, but a piece of criminal evidence. The officers began marching Julian toward the exit. He dragged his feet, twisting his neck to look back at me one last time. Chloe, you cannot survive without me. You do not know how to run a massive tech company. You are just a housewife. You will fail. I stepped forward, signaling my guards to let me pass, closing the distance between us, until I was standing just inches from his face. I leaned in so only he could hear my final words. I built Vanguard Holdings from a cheap laptop in my kitchen while you were out partying with investors, I whispered. I funded your company. I wrote the core algorithm you claimed as your own. I let you play the genius because it kept the spotlight off me while I built my real empire. I am not a housewife, Julian. I am your boss, and you are fired. I stepped back and nodded to the officers. Take him away. Julian was dragged through the revolving doors, his shouts entirely muffled by the thick glass. Beatrice sat sobbing on the sofa, ignored by the busy hotel staff. Vanessa fled back out into the rain, terrified of the legal consequences rushing toward her. Marcus offered me a small, respectful smile before turning to leave, eager to distance himself from the absolute wreckage of Julian's family. I stood in the center of the beautiful, quiet lobby. The storm outside was raging, but inside I had never felt so calm. I turned to my private security detail. We are done here, I said. Let us go upstairs. My son is sleeping, and I have a multi-billion-dollar company to restructure in the morning. The first phase of my plan was executed flawlessly, but the war was far from over. Across the city, running through the pouring rain in a panicked frenzy, Vanessa had finally realized the catastrophic danger she was in. She had fled the hotel when the truth about Vanguard Holdings dropped, leaving Julian to face the slaughter alone. But Vanessa was not just a mistress. She was the public relations director for Apex AI. She knew that if I took full control of the company, she would not just lose her job. She would be implicated in the federal embezzlement investigation regarding the corporate funds used to buy her affection. Soaking wet and shivering in the back of a yellow cab, Vanessa gave the driver the address to the Apex AI corporate headquarters. She had the master keys. She had the passwords. She had direct access to the entire investor database and every major media outlet in the country. She stormed into her glass corner office, her hands shaking as she booted up her dual monitors. If Chloe wanted to play the ruthless corporate raider, Vanessa decided she would completely destroy Chloe's public image before the sun came up. She opened a blank press release and began typing a fabricated explosive narrative about a deranged, jealous wife launching an illegal hostile takeover to destroy a visionary tech company. Vanessa's fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, fueled by sheer panic and a third cup of black coffee. She worked relentlessly through the night, weaponizing every media contact she had cultivated over her career. By 6 in the morning, anonymous, highly damaging dossiers hit the inboxes of every major tech journalist and financial blogger in Manhattan. The spin was masterful, entirely devoid of the truth, and designed to completely obliterate my credibility before I could even explain my actions. The headlines dropped like bombs onto the morning news feeds. Apex AI under siege. Founder's wife attempts hostile takeover. Jealous housewife embezzles millions in bitter domestic dispute. Then came the calculated character assassination. Vanessa leaked carefully doctored emails suggesting I had suffered a severe postpartum breakdown that never truly resolved. The narrative she spun painted me as an unstable, paranoid woman, violently jealous of Julian's corporate success. Worse, the articles claimed I had illegally seized control of Vanguard Holdings through a clerical loophole to exact personal revenge, culminating in the kidnapping of our young son. Public opinion shifted with terrifying speed. Social media algorithms devoured the sensational story. Financial commentators on morning podcasts questioned my mental fitness and demanded a federal investigation into my actions. Apex AI corporate partners began expressing public concern, causing their private valuation to plummet and secondary market shares to wobble violently. The tech world woke up to a narrative of a visionary leader under attack by a deranged spouse. Julian seized the momentum flawlessly. At 8 in the morning, he walked onto the brightly lit set of the nation's premier financial morning broadcast. He wore a crisp navy suit, but his tie was deliberately loosened, his hair perfectly tousled, to convey the image of a man running on pure dedication and absolute heartbreak. He looked like a martyr. The anchor leaned forward, her expression a mask of manufactured sympathy. Julian, the tech world is in shock this morning. Can you explain what exactly is happening at Apex AI? Julian looked directly into the camera, his eyes wide and mournful. It is a tragedy, he said, his voice thick with rehearsed emotion. I have spent my entire life building Apex AI, creating technology that will change the world. But my greatest priority has always been my family. Unfortunately, my wife Chloe has been struggling with severe mental health issues for years. I tried to shield her. I tried to get her professional help, but yesterday she suffered a complete break from reality. The anchor nodded solemnly. And the allegations of embezzlement, the sudden capital recall threatening your company, a complete fabrication born of her illness. Julian lied smoothly, not missing a single beat. She manipulated a dormant shadow LLC structure from our early funding days to temporarily freeze our operating accounts. She is holding my company hostage, but more importantly, she has taken our son. I have not seen Leo since yesterday afternoon. She is highly unstable, heavily armed with a private security detail, and refusing all contact. I am begging the authorities to intervene before she hurts him or herself. He wiped a dry eye, projecting the ultimate image of a devoted father and brilliant CEO under malicious attack. I will fight for my company. Julian concluded, his voice hardening with fake resolve. But I will fight harder for my son. Chloe, if you are watching this, please, come home. Let me get you the medical help you desperately need. High above the city, in the reinforced security of my penthouse suite at the St. Regis, I watched Julian's performance on the massive flat-screen television. I did not throw my coffee mug. I did not scream in frustration. I did not cry. I simply took a sip of my espresso, noting how Julian had stolen my favorite phrase about fighting for Leo and twisted it for his own pathetic PR stunt. Leo was sitting on this plush rug mere feet away, happily building a massive tower out of colorful wooden blocks, completely oblivious to the media firestorm raging outside our walls. He was safe, he was happy, and he was entirely separated from the toxicity of his father. My phone began to vibrate violently on the glass coffee table. Notifications poured in by the hundreds. Friends I had not spoken to in years, distant relatives, and former colleagues were blowing up my messages demanding to know if I had lost my mind. The smear campaign was working exactly as Vanessa intended. They were controlling the narrative, banking on the sexist age-old trope of the crazy, bitter ex-wife to discredit my legitimate financial authority. They thought they had me cornered. They assumed I would panic, issue a frantic defensive press release, or worse, break the restraining order to confront them and prove their point. They were playing a desperate game of checkers, while I was moving the final pieces across a chessboard they did not even know existed. I muted the television, cutting off the sound of Julian's manufactured grief. I picked up my phone and bypassed the flood of panicked messages, scrolling directly to a private encrypted contact. I tapped the screen and held the phone to my ear. The line rang exactly once before a sharp, authoritative voice answered. Diana Chen, Senior Partner, Vanguard Legal. Go ahead, Chloe. Diana was a legal shark, a woman who terrified corporate boardrooms and ate hostile takeovers for breakfast. She had been quietly managing Vanguard Holdings' shadow structure for 7 years, waiting for the day I would finally take the leash off. Have you seen the morning broadcasts? I asked, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Diana let out a sharp, genuine laugh. Oh, I have seen them. Julian is putting on an Oscar-worthy performance. Vanessa really earned her non-existent paycheck with this media blitz. Half of Wall Street currently thinks you are a deranged kidnapper who stumbled into a venture capital fund by accident. Should I draft the cease and desist orders for defamation? No, I replied, staring out the window at the rain-lashed Manhattan skyline. Do not interrupt them. When an enemy is digging their own grave, you do not take away their shovel. You hand them a bigger one. What is the play? Chloe Diana asked, instantly shifting into battle mode. Julian just went on national television and publicly claimed that I am mentally unfit, I stated, pacing slowly across the thick carpet. He explicitly stated that the capital recall is a fraudulent action born of a psychological breakdown. He lied about the embezzlement to millions of viewers and investors. He has officially brought Apex AI into disrepute on a global scale. I heard the satisfying sound of Diana shuffling heavy legal documents over the encrypted line. He certainly did, she agreed. He violated 12 different investor protection clauses in a single 5-minute interview. Then it is time to end this charade, I said coldly. Let them enjoy their morning headlines. Let Vanessa think she won the media war. Let Julian believe his public tears saved his empire. And then at exactly noon, I want you to execute the final directive. Let them dig their grave deeper. It is time to trigger the morality clause. Consider it done, Diana replied. I heard the sharp clack of her mechanical keyboard over the encrypted line. The morality clause is officially live. Julian just handed us the exact public scandal required to bypass the standard 30-day financial notice. I am executing the total asset freeze right now. Within 60 seconds, the financial guillotine dropped. Vanguard Holdings possessed absolute legal authority over the entire capital structure of Apex AI. Because Julian had arrogantly commingled his personal finances, his hidden offshore accounts, and his mother's lavish trust fund with the company's operating capital, the freeze infected absolutely everything. It was a flawless surgical strike. Every credit card, every line of credit, and every corporate account tied to Julian's name immediately flashed red across global banking servers. I did not have to wait long to see the results. Less than an hour later, my phone chimed with a secure message from my private investigator. He sent a live video feed from the lobby of Manhattan's most exclusive private wealth bank. Beatrice had marched into the bank demanding a $200,000 cashier's check. She needed retail therapy to cope with the immense stress of the morning planning to empty the Apex Trust before any of my lawyers could get their hands on it. She stood at the mahogany counter, wearing her oversized Chanel sunglasses indoors, tapping her French manicured nails impatiently against the polished wood. The bank manager, a man who usually greeted her with a glass of imported champagne, looked at his computer screen with sheer terror. Mrs. Thorne, I am so sorry, he stammered. Your accounts are locked. All of them. Beatrice ripped off her sunglasses. Do not be absurd. I am Beatrice Thorne. Refresh your screen immediately and fetch me my money. I cannot do that, madam. A federal freeze has been initiated by Vanguard Holdings, citing suspected corporate embezzlement and severe breach of fiduciary duty. Your personal trust fund is tethered directly to the liquidity of Apex AI. The balance is currently inaccessible. You have zero available funds. Beatrice unleashed a shriek that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She slammed her designer handbag against the counter, knocking over a heavy crystal pen holder. Do you know who my son is? He was just on national television. We are billionaires. You are stealing my money. I want you fired. I want the police called right this second. The police are already involved in this matter. Mrs. Thorne, the manager said, his voice dropping to a harsh warning whisper. If you do not lower your voice and leave the premises immediately, I will have bank security escort you out for creating a public disturbance. Beatrice looked around. The elite clientele of the bank were staring at her with blatant disgust. The wealthy had zero tolerance for public tantrums. Humiliated, entirely penniless, and finally grasping the devastating reality of her situation, she snatched her bag and practically ran for the heavy glass doors. Her untouchable social status was completely obliterated in less than 5 minutes. Julian's downfall was happening simultaneously. After his stellar tear-filled performance on the morning broadcast, he confidently exited the television studio, fully expecting his fabricated narrative to dominate the news cycle. He walked toward the curb where his corporate-leased Maybach was always waiting. The driver was standing outside the vehicle, but he did not open the heavy door. Instead, he held up a digital tablet. "Get in the car!" Marcus, Julian snapped, adjusting his silk tie. "Take me to the private airfield. I need to get out of the city until Vanessa's public relations campaign finishes burying my psychotic wife." The driver shook his head. "I cannot do that, Mr. Thorne. The leasing company just received an emergency federal directive from Vanguard Holdings. Your corporate transportation privileges have been permanently revoked. I have been instructed to repossess the vehicle immediately." Julian's arrogant smile vanished. "You work for me. I am the chief executive officer of Apex AI. You are the chief executive officer," the driver corrected flatly. "Please step away from the vehicle." Julian pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed his private aviation broker. "I need the Gulfstream prepped for wheels up in 30 minutes, he barked into the receiver. A long, heavy pause followed. "Mr. Thorne, your corporate accounts have been frozen. Your personal black card just declined. We cannot authorize any flight plans without a clearing deposit." Julian ended the call, his breathing turning ragged. He stood on the busy Manhattan sidewalk, the morning sun beating down on his expensive suit. He was entirely locked out of his own life. The millions he had stolen were trapped offshore, completely inaccessible. The corporate accounts he used as his personal piggy bank were shut down by the very woman he had called a useless, pathetic housewife. He had no car, no jet, no money, and nowhere to run. Driven into a desperate claustrophobic corner, Julian did the only thing a cornered rat could do. He limped into the sleazy, dimly lit office of his aggressive divorce attorneys. He had no massive retainer to pay them, but he promised them an enormous percentage of whatever wealth he could extract from me. "She holds the purse strings." Julian paced the room, his eyes wide and frantic. "Vanguard controls absolutely everything. I need leverage. I need something that will force her to drop the asset freeze and sign over my company." His lead attorney, a ruthless man with a reputation for vicious courtroom theatrics, slid a printed copy of Vanessa's fabricated press release across the mahogany desk. "You already gave us the leverage, Julian. The media is currently painting your wife as a dangerously unstable kidnapping embezzler who suffered a total mental break." Julian stared at the article, a dark, wicked realization washing over his face. "We are not filing for a financial settlement." The attorney smiled coldly. "We are filing for an emergency ex parte custody hearing this afternoon. We use the public smear campaign as legal evidence of her mental collapse. We tell the judge she is a severe danger to the child. We strip Leo away from her permanently. She will surrender every single dime she has to get him back. The heavy oak doors of Family Court Part 4 swung open and Julian marched in, looking like the perfect beleaguered tech visionary. He had swapped his standard aggressive power suit for a softer, understated gray ensemble, complete with a subtly patterned tie designed to make him look approachable and deeply distressed. Vanessa trailed half a step behind him, clutching a thick leather binder to her chest. She had completely abandoned her usual plunging necklines for a modest high-collared blouse, perfectly playing the role of the deeply concerned corporate colleague who had been dragged into a domestic nightmare. Beatrice brought up the rear, dabbing her entirely dry eyes with a monogrammed silk handkerchief. She leaned heavily on Julian's arm, the very picture of a devastated grandmother terrified for her grandson's safety. I was already seated at the respondents' table. I wore a tailored black suit with minimal jewelry, projecting an aura of absolute unshakable calm. Beside me sat Diana Chen. She was not a standard family law attorney. Diana was a ruthless corporate litigator who specialized in hostile takeovers, financial warfare, and tearing apart fraudulent contracts. She sat with her hands steepled in front of her, watching Julian's theatrical entrance with the detached amusement of a predator, observing a particularly slow-moving prey. Julian's lead attorney, a notorious legal mercenary named Vance Sterling, wasted absolutely no time. He stood before Judge Eleanor Harris, a woman known for her strict no-nonsense rulings in high-stakes custody battles, and launched his opening salvo. Your Honor, we are here today under the most dire emergency circumstances imaginable. Vance began, his voice echoing off the paneled walls with practiced urgency. My client, Julian Thorne, a highly respected chief executive officer, has been the victim of a catastrophic and malicious domestic attack. His wife, Chloe, has suffered a severe psychological break. Vance lifted a thick stack of printed articles, the exact pieces Vanessa had leaked to the press just hours prior. He submitted them to the clerk with a dramatic flourish. The media is already reporting on her highly erratic behavior. Your Honor, the tech world is in shock. She has illegally locked my client out of his own home. She has initiated an unauthorized and deeply unhinged financial strike against his company, abusing a clerical loophole to freeze his hard-earned assets. But most terrifying of all, she has taken their 5-year-old son Leo and surrounded herself with armed mercenaries. She has kidnapped this boy. He paced back and forth, pointing an accusatory finger in my direction. She has no income. She has no career. She is a completely dependent housewife who is currently holding a child hostage to extort a brilliant man out of his life's work. She is a massive flight risk with zero means to support this boy on her own. My client is terrified for his son's physical and emotional well-being. We are asking the court to grant immediate full physical and legal custody to Mr. Thorne, and to order a mandatory psychiatric evaluation for the mother. Judge Harris frowned, flipping through the fabricated press clippings. Julian sat at his table, casting a quick, sorrowful look at the judge before dropping his gaze to his hands, playing the victim to absolute perfection. In the gallery, Vanessa nodded solemnly, her hands clasped tightly over her binder. To bolster their false narrative, Vance called Beatrice to the stand. My mother-in-law walked slowly to the witness box, gripping the wooden rail as if she might collapse from the sheer weight of her fictional sorrow. She swore to tell the truth, a promise she had absolutely no intention of keeping. Tell us about your daughter-in-law's daily routine, Mrs. Thorne Vance prompted gently, offering her a glass of water. Beatrice let out a perfectly timed shuddering sigh. It breaks my heart to say this in open court. She began looking at the judge with wide, tear-filled eyes. But Chloe was never a true mother to that sweet boy. While my son worked 80-hour weeks building a future for them, Chloe spent her days lounging at luxury spas on Julian's hard-earned dimes. She contributed absolutely nothing to the household. She had no interest in business, no ambition, and frankly very little interest in Leo. Beatrice paused, pressing the silk handkerchief to her lips, ensuring the court reporter caught her distress. She left him with an endless rotation of nannies while she shopped for designer clothes she did not even appreciate. She drained my son's personal accounts. When Julian finally tried to set reasonable financial boundaries yesterday, she snapped. She has always been bitterly jealous of his intellect, of his success. And now she is using my innocent grandson as a pawn. Your Honor, I am begging you as a grandmother. Give my son his boy back before she does something unthinkable. I sat completely still. I did not glare at Beatrice. I did not shake my head at Vance's ridiculous lies. I did not leap up to defend my honor. I knew exactly what they wanted. They wanted me to yell, to cry, to lose my temper so they could point at me and validate the crazy housewife narrative Vanessa had meticulously crafted. I denied them that satisfaction. I sat with my hands folded neatly, my breathing steady and slow. Beside me, Diana had listened to the entire absurd performance without writing down a single note. Julian looked over at me, a smug, victorious smirk briefly breaking through his stoic mask. He truly believed he had won. He believed that the law, the media, and his wealth would crush me into submission, just as they always had. He thought my silence was surrender. Judge Harris leaned forward, folding her hands together on the heavy wooden bench. The courtroom was dead silent, waiting for the gavel to drop. She looked down at the fabricated press clippings, then shifted her stern, assessing gaze directly onto me. The narrative was expertly woven. Julian looked like the stoic, betrayed provider. Beatrice played the heartbroken elder. Vanessa sat in the gallery, validating their corporate nightmare. To any outside observer, I was exactly what they claimed. I was, a vindictive, unemployed parasite throwing a dangerous, illegal tantrum to ruin a great man. The judge looks sternly at Chloe, seemingly swayed by the narrative of the unemployed, vindictive housewife. Chloe's lawyer stands up, holding a sealed envelope from the IRS. Diana Chen stood up, moving with the lethal grace of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. She did not raise her voice. She did not match Vance Sterling's theatrical outrage. Instead, she held up a thick, securely sealed manila envelope bearing the official insignia of the Internal Revenue Service. Your Honor, if it pleases the court, Diana began, her tone perfectly, even slicing through the heavy manufactured tension in the room. Opposing counsel has painted a highly vivid, albeit entirely fictional portrait of my client. They have submitted tabloid gossip and fabricated press releases as evidence of her character. We prefer to rely on federal documentation. Vance Sterling immediately jumped to his feet, his face flushed with indignation. Objection, Your Honor. This is an emergency custody hearing, not a financial audit. We are here to determine the immediate safety of a minor child, not to review tax filings. Judge Harris stared Vance down over the rim of her glasses. You spent the last 20 minutes attacking the respondent's financial stability and mental fitness, Mr. Sterling. You opened this door. I am going to allow it. Overruled. Proceed, Miss Chen. Diana approached the bench and handed the heavy envelope directly to the clerk, who passed it up to the judge. She then turned and handed a duplicate binder to a suddenly very pale Vance Sterling. Inside that envelope, Your Honor, you will find fully unsealed certified copies of my client's personal and corporate tax returns spanning the last 7 years, Diana explained, pacing slowly back to our table. You will also find the original countersigned corporate ownership documents, SEC filings, and the operating agreements for a private entity known as Vanguard Holdings. The courtroom went dead silent. The only sound was the sharp rustle of heavy paper as Judge Harris broke the IRS seal and began reviewing the documents. Her eyes darted rapidly across the pages, her brow furrowing in deep concentration. The stern, judgmental expression she had previously directed at me slowly vanished, replaced by a look of profound realization and rising anger. At the petitioner's table, Julian leaned forward, straining to see the papers in Vance's hands. What is she talking about? Julian hissed, his voice carrying in the quiet room. What did you just hand him? Vance did not answer. He was staring at the corporate filings, his mouth slightly open, the aggressive swagger completely draining from his posture. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine. Diana turned to face the courtroom, locking eyes with Julian before addressing the judge. My client is not unemployed, Your Honor. She is the sole proprietor of Vanguard Holdings, making her the 68% majority shareholder of Apex AI. Legally speaking, Mr. Thorne is merely my client's employee. Julian physically recoiled as if he had been struck across the face. He slammed his back against his heavy wooden chair, the arrogant, polished veneer of the tech visionary entirely wiped away. His mouth worked silently, unable to form words. He looked down at his hands, then up at the judge, panic flooding his eyes as the absolute reality of his situation crushed him. He did not own the company. He had never truly owned the company. He had signed the proxy agreements years ago, blinded by his own hubris, assuming his quiet, supportive wife would never enforce them. In the gallery directly behind him, Beatrice let out a loud, strangled gasp. She clutched her chest, her diamond rings flashing under the fluorescent lights as she slumped back against the wooden bench. The horrified realization that her lavish lifestyle, her unlimited trust fund, and her prestigious social standing were entirely funded by the very woman she had just spent 10 minutes calling a useless parasite visibly knocked the wind out of her. The financial freeze initiated this morning was not the erratic action of a vindictive housewife. Diana continued, her voice ringing with absolute authority. It was a lawful, calculated corporate directive executed by a majority shareholder to halt a rogue chief executive officer suspected of gross financial misconduct, embezzlement, and the illicit commingling of corporate funds with his mistress. My client did not kidnap her son. She removed him from a toxic environment while she lawfully secured her own corporate assets. Judge Harris dropped the documents onto her desk with a loud, definitive smack. She looked directly at Vance Sterling, her eyes blazing with judicial fury. Mr. Sterling, you stood in my courtroom and presented fabricated public relations articles as sworn evidence. You deliberately attempted to weaponize this family court to execute a corporate cover-up for your client. You accused a fit, employed, and highly responsible mother of a psychological break to steal her child. Vance swallowed hard, stepping back from his podium. Your Honor, my client assured me that the media reports were accurate. I had no knowledge of this shadow corporate structure. I do not care what your client assured you, Judge Harris snapped, her voice like a whip. Ignorance is not an excuse for perjury, and I will not tolerate this court being used as an instrument of extortion. The emergency custody claim is thrown out entirely. Full physical and legal custody remains exclusively with the mother. Mr. Thorne will be granted 0 visitation until a thorough investigation is conducted into his financial and personal conduct. Julian buried his face in his hands, completely broken. His entire empire, his son, his reputation, all of it had been legally and ruthlessly dismantled in less than 5 minutes. Furthermore, Judge Harris continued, picking up her heavy wooden gavel. I am referring this matter, along with these sealed IRS documents, directly to the district attorney's office to investigate Mr. Thorne for perjury and potential corporate fraud. As the judge's words echoed through the courtroom, sealing Julian's absolute ruin, I noticed a slight movement in the gallery. Vanessa, realizing that the ship was not just sinking, but had already hit the ocean floor, was slowly and silently standing up. She clutched her binder tightly against her chest, her eyes darting toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the room. She took one quiet step backward, desperately trying to slip out of the courtroom before the fallout could touch her. Judge Harris narrowed her eyes, raising her hand and pointing directly at the back of the room. Stop right there. Not so fast, Vanessa. You are not going anywhere. Stop right there. Not so fast, Vanessa. You are not going anywhere. Vanessa froze, with her hand hovering inches from the heavy brass handle of the courtroom door. She turned around slowly, the color draining entirely from her face. The confident, concerned colleague persona she had worn into the building had completely evaporated. She looked like a thief caught under a harsh spotlight. Judge Harris motioned with her gavel, pointing directly at the space beside Julian's table. Step back up here, the judge commanded. Stand right next to Mr. Thorne. I am not finished with either of you. The clicking of Vanessa's expensive stilettos echoed like gunshots in the dead silent room. She walked back with her head held unnaturally stiff, her breathing shallow and rapid. She stood next to Julian, who was still slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the mahogany table as if it held the answers to his ruined life. Judge Harris opened the thick leather binder Diana had submitted, flipping past the tax returns and landing squarely on a section tabbed with red tape. The judge ran her finger down a printed ledger, then looked up, her gaze locking onto Vanessa's throat. "That is a truly spectacular piece of jewelry you are wearing today," Ms. Vanessa, Judge Harris observed. Her tone was conversational, which only made it more terrifying. "A platinum collar setting with what appears to be flawless princess-cut diamonds. It practically caught the light from across the room the moment you walked in." Vanessa swallowed hard. Her hand flew up instinctively to cover the glittering stones resting against her collarbone. "Thank you, Your Honor," she stammered, her voice barely a squeak. "It was a gift." "Oh, I know exactly what it is," Judge Harris replied, her voice dropping into a register of pure ice. "According to the emergency financial audit submitted by Vanguard Holdings, that specific piece of jewelry was purchased exactly 24 hours ago at a luxury boutique on Fifth Avenue. The retail price was $85,000. The courtroom erupted into a collective hushed murmur. Beatrice put a trembling hand to her mouth, staring in horror at the mistress who had brazenly flaunted stolen wealth in a federal building. Judge Harris tapped the ledger with her pen. "The audit clearly shows that the $85,000 transaction was authorized using an Apex AI corporate executive credit card, a card that, as we have just established through irrefutable IRS documents, draws upon operating capital completely owned and controlled by Vanguard Holdings. Which means, Ms. Vanessa, that money belongs entirely to the woman sitting quietly at the respondent table." I watched Vanessa's face twist into a mask of sheer panic. She looked desperately at Julian, silently begging him to intervene, to assert his authority, to do anything to save her. But Julian was broken. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, physically recoiling away from her, desperate to distance himself from the radioactive fallout of his own arrogance. "You are wearing stolen property in my courtroom," Judge Harris stated flatly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You used misappropriated corporate funds to purchase a luxury item while actively plotting to strip a mother of her child, using fabricated claims of financial ruin. It is the most brazen display of arrogance I have seen from this bench in 20 years. Your Honor, I did not know," Vanessa pleaded, her voice trembling wildly. "Julian told me the account was clear. He told me the company paid for executive expenses." "Save your excuses for the district attorney," Judge Harris interrupted sharply. "Bailiff, step forward." A broad-shouldered court officer immediately uncrossed his arms and marched over to the petitioner's table. He produced a thick, clear plastic evidence bag, holding it open right in front of Vanessa's chest. "Take it off," Judge Harris ordered. "You will surrender the necklace immediately. It is now classified as evidence of corporate embezzlement and financial fraud." Vanessa let out a quiet, humiliating sob. Her hands shook violently as she reached behind her neck, fumbling with the complicated platinum clasp. The elite gallery, filled with legal aids, reporters, and wealthy onlookers, watched in absolute fascination as the glamorous mistress was publicly stripped of her stolen spoils. She finally undid the clasp, letting the heavy diamond necklace slide off her skin and drop into the plastic evidence bag with a dull, pathetic thud. The bailiff sealed the bag and carried it over to our table, placing it directly in front of Diana, who simply nodded in acknowledgement without breaking her intense stare on Julian. "Let this serve as a final warning to both of you," Judge Harris said, gathering her files. "This court is formally adjourned. You are dismissed, and I suggest you both retain criminal defense counsel before the sun goes down." The moment the gavel struck the sounding block, Julian bolted from his chair. He did not wait for Vance Sterling. He did not wait for his weeping mother. He grabbed Vanessa by the arm and practically dragged her toward the side exit, desperate to avoid the swarm of reporters undoubtedly gathering outside the main courtroom doors. They pushed through the heavy service doors and stumbled into the dimly lit concrete stairwell of the courthouse, the sound of the heavy metal door slamming shut behind them. Julian leaned against the cinder-block wall, his chest heaving as he loosened his perfectly patterned tie, trying to pull oxygen into his panicked lungs. "We lost Vanessa," cried, pacing the narrow landing. We lost the PR war. We lost the legal battle. They are going to send us to prison, Julian. She took my necklace. She took everything. You told me Vanguard was dormant. Shut up, Julian hissed, his eyes wide and frantic. Just shut up and let me think. He pulled out his phone, staring at the shattered remains of his digital empire. His bank accounts were frozen. His public image was destroyed. His custody claim was dismissed with prejudice. He knew Diana Chen was currently locking down every legitimate server and holding company associated with Apex AI. But Julian was a man who operated in the shadows, and he had built one final deeply illegal failsafe into the company's architecture. We are not going to prison, Julian snarled, his voice dropping into a venomous, desperate whisper. Chloe thinks she froze the entire capital structure, but she does not know about the Genesis protocol. I mirrored the core source code of the Apex artificial intelligence algorithm on an unregistered offshore server in the Cayman Islands. It is the actual intellectual property. It is worth billions, and her lawyers cannot trace it if I sever the connection from the inside. Vanessa stopped pacing, her tear-streaked face looking at him with desperate hope. Can you sell it? Julian's eyes darkened with malicious intent. I already have a buyer in Dubai willing to pay $300 million in untraceable cryptocurrency for the stolen source code, but I need to initiate the transfer manually from the main terminal at the Apex headquarters before Vanguard's auditors lock the building down. We have to bypass security, trigger the upload, and completely wipe the primary servers. We are going to burn her company to the absolute ground. Julian and Vanessa sprinted from the courthouse service exit, diving into the back of a grimy yellow taxi, since their corporate Maybach had been repossessed. Julian barked the address of the Apex AI headquarters at the bewildered driver, throwing a crumpled $100 bill through the plastic partition. As the cab lurched into the chaotic Manhattan traffic, Julian frantically typed commands into his encrypted phone. He initiated a total facility lockdown. He revoked all standard guest passes, deactivated the biometric scanners in the lobby, and ordered the private security firm to barricade the ground floor. Julian leaned back against the cracked leather seat, his chest heaving as he wiped a bead of cold sweat from his forehead. Chloe is weak, he muttered, trying to convince himself as much as Vanessa. She just got her precious son back. She will be at the hotel crying over him, playing the devoted mother. She will not make a move on the corporate infrastructure until tomorrow morning at the earliest. That gives us a window. A very small, very critical window. 20 minutes later, they bypassed the locked lobby using a private freight elevator and stormed into the penthouse boardroom of Apex AI. The room was a monument to Julian's massive ego. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a breathtaking 360-degree view of the city skyline. A massive table carved from a single slab of polished black marble dominated the center of the room. Seated around that table were the 7 remaining members of the Apex AI board of directors. They were a collection of wealthy, highly connected executives who had just watched their company's valuation absolutely hemorrhage on the secondary markets. They looked terrified, gripping their coffee cups and checking their tablets as the financial world crumbled around them. Julian took his place at the head of the table. He did not sit. He planted his hands firmly on the cold marble, leaning forward to project dominance. Vanessa stood tightly by his side, rubbing her bare neck where the $85,000 diamond necklace had rested just an hour prior. Her eyes burned with a feral, desperate intensity. "We are facing a hostile, completely illegal corporate takeover," Julian announced, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "My estranged wife has suffered a catastrophic mental breakdown. She has stolen Vanguard Holdings from its dormant state and is attempting to leverage a 68% majority stake to liquidate this company. If she succeeds, your equity will be reduced to ash by tomorrow morning. Every single dollar you have invested in this firm will vanish." A murmur of absolute panic swept through the room. Arthur Penhaligon, the chief risk officer, stood up, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Julian, the financial networks are reporting a total asset freeze. The banks are locking us out. We have zero liquidity. How do we stop a majority shareholder from executing a proxy takeover?" Julian offered a dark, calculated smile. "We rewrite the math, Arthur. We authorize an immediate emergency dilution of the capital structure." The room went dead silent. The board members stared at Julian, waiting for the punchline to a very bad joke. When none came, the reality of his proposal set in. I want authorization to issue 50 million new Class A voting shares, Julian instructed, his voice dropping into a harsh, commanding register. We create phantom shares and immediately distribute them into offshore holding accounts controlled entirely by this board. We will backdate the executive authorization to the previous fiscal quarter, framing it as a closed-door compensation package that was approved before the Vanguard freeze went into effect. You want us to print fake stock? Arthur stated, his voice trembling with sheer disbelief. You want us to artificially inflate the share pool to dilute Vanguard holdings from a 68% majority down to a 12% minority. Exactly, Vanessa chimed in, slamming her leather binder onto the table. If Chloe only holds 12%, she cannot unilaterally call a proxy vote. She cannot freeze our operations. She becomes a minority nuisance. We strip her of her fangs before she even realizes she has been bitten. She is currently distracted with her child. She will not check the corporate registry until the morning, and by then the new share structure will be locked into the international servers. Arthur shook his head violently, taking a physical step back from the table. That is textbook securities fraud. It is a federal crime. You are asking us to falsify corporate documents and manipulate the stock pool. If the SEC uncovers this, we will all go to federal prison. Julian slammed his fist onto the marble, the loud crack making several executives jump in their seats. You will go to prison anyway if she opens our books, he roared, letting his polished mask slip completely. Do you think she will stop with me? She will audit every single department. She will find the bloated expense reports, the redirected funds, the offshore kickbacks you have all been enjoying for the past 5 years. We all sink or we all swim, Arthur. I am offering you complete immunity. I will personally guarantee your payouts the second the Dubai buyers purchase our source code. But you have to vote yes right now. At the far end of the marble table, sitting in absolute silence, was Marcus. As the senior internal auditor, Marcus was the only man in the room who truly understood the catastrophic depths of Julian's financial mismanagement. He was also Julian's brother-in-law, married to Julian's younger sister. For years, Julian had treated Marcus like a glorified accountant, constantly belittling him at family dinners and ignoring his repeated warnings about the company's reckless spending. Julian assumed family loyalty and corporate greed would keep Marcus compliant. He assumed completely wrong. Marcus watched Julian sweat and scream. He watched Vanessa glare at the terrified executives. He listened to the desperate, pathetic rationalizations of a cornered sociopath willing to drag everyone down with him. Marcus had spent the last 2 years quietly gathering evidence, waiting for the exact moment Julian pushed his luck too far. As Julian continued to badger and threaten the board members into committing federal fraud, Marcus slowly slid his hand beneath the heavy lip of the marble table. He felt blindly for the concealed security panel mounted underneath the wood paneling. His fingertips brushed against the smooth, indented surface of the emergency override button. Julian was entirely focused on screaming at Arthur, unaware that the building's absolute lockdown was about to be breached. Marcus looked toward the thick, frosted glass doors leading to the private executive elevator bank. He locked his jaw, took a slow, deep breath, and quietly pressed the button. A tiny, muted chime echoed through the floorboards. The red security light above the elevator bank instantly shifted to a welcoming, bright green. The doors were unlocked and the wolves were finally being let inside. Marcus lowered his hand from the underside of the heavy marble table, feeling the satisfying mechanical click of the security override engage. Above the thick frosted glass doors leading to the private executive elevator bank, the security panel chirped softly. The restricted access light shifted instantly from a locked warning crimson to a welcoming, brilliant green. Julian and Vanessa were entirely too busy terrorizing the captive board of directors to notice the subtle shift in the room's defenses. Marcus sat perfectly still, folding his hands neatly on the polished stone surface, letting his mind snap back to the reality of what he had set in motion just 12 hours prior. The torrential freezing rain had hammered relentlessly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Chloe's discreet downtown hotel suite. Marcus had stood in the center of her temporary living room, his heavy leather briefcase clutched in his hands like a physical shield. Beside him stood his wife Maya. As Julian's younger sister, Maya had spent her entire life shrinking under the oppressive, suffocating weight of the Thorne family's relentless demands. She had been rigorously conditioned by her mother Beatrice to ignore the casual cruelty her family inflicted on the world to maintain their status. But watching Julian launch a coordinated, ruthless, and entirely fabricated legal attack to rip a 5-year-old child from his mother had finally shattered that lifelong conditioning. Maya had walked directly up to Chloe, dropping her wet umbrella onto the hardwood floor, and pulled her sister-in-law into a fierce, desperate embrace. The tears she shed were not performative, calculated drops like the ones Beatrice utilized in court. They were jagged, ugly, and entirely real. Maya looked Chloe dead in the eye and confessed everything she knew about the malicious smear campaign Vanessa had orchestrated with the tabloids. She explicitly stated she was burning her ties to the Thorne legacy forever. She refused to let her brother destroy another innocent life, for profit, firmly declaring that she was choosing the truth over toxic bloodlines. Marcus had unclasped his briefcase, bypassing the emotional pleasantries to deliver the killing blow. As the senior internal auditor for Apex AI, he possessed a brilliant financial mind that operated with surgical, unyielding precision. Julian had always treated him as a glorified calculator, a quiet, compliant relative who could be bullied into rubber-stamping fraudulent expense reports to keep the family peace. Julian had vastly, fatally underestimated him. Marcus pulled out a thick, heavily bound dossier and an encrypted military-grade titanium flash drive, dropping them onto Chloe's glass coffee table with a heavy thud. As a man of strict, unwavering integrity, Marcus explained exactly how he had tracked the staggering discrepancies within the corporate ledger. He detailed the intricate web of offshore shell companies Julian and Vanessa had established to siphon Vanguard Holdings' operating capital. He mapped out the illegal wire transfers, the fabricated vendor invoices masking Vanessa's luxury purchases, and the deliberate criminal manipulation of the quarterly earnings reports. Julian had cornered Marcus 2 days prior, ordering him to certify the fraudulent books, assuming his brother-in-law would blindly comply to protect his own lucrative salary and standing within the family. Marcus told Chloe he absolutely refused to compromise his professional license or his personal morality for a thief. He handed her the encryption key, giving her the definitive, undeniable, and legally binding proof required to freeze the corporate accounts, execute her proxy takeover, and trigger the Internal Revenue Service investigation. The memory evaporated instantly as Julian's voice cracked like a whip across the penthouse boardroom, snapping Marcus back to the chaotic present. The air in the room was thick with palpable panic and recycled oxygen. Julian was pacing frantically behind the black marble table, pointing an accusing, trembling finger at Arthur Penhaligon. The chief risk officer was drenched in sweat, his custom-tailored shirt clinging uncomfortably to his back. Julian demanded absolute compliance. He demanded the immediate, unquestioned creation of the 50 million phantom shares to save his own skin. He leaned heavily over the table, locking his bloodshot eyes with each terrified executive. He promised them complete, ironclad financial immunity. He painted Chloe as a deranged, unstable, and vindictive threat who would gleefully liquidate their pensions, cancel their stock options, and leave them with nothing. He aggressively sold the illegal stock dilution as their only viable lifeboat in a sinking ship. Vanessa flanked him, nodding vigorously. Her eyes darted around the enclosed room like a cornered animal, silently marking exactly who was hesitating. She promised the board that once Vanguard Holdings was diluted from a 68% supermajority down to a powerless 12% minority stake, they could instantly finalize the clandestine Dubai sale. She assured them they could all walk away as untouchable billionaires. All they needed was a simple majority vote to bypass the standard Securities and Exchange Commission waiting period and overwrite the corporate registry. Arthur wiped his forehead with a shaking hand, looking around the table for any sign of resistance, any beacon of rationality. But the sheer, suffocating force of Julian's desperation was breaking them. One by one, the executives began to crack under the immense pressure rationalizing the felony. They were prioritizing their own immediate desperate survival over federal law. Julian recognized the distinct shift in the room's energy. He seized the momentum, slamming his palms flat against the cold marble to command their total attention. "We vote right now," Julian roared, his voice hoarse and commanding. "I am calling for the immediate binding resolution to initiate the emergency stock dilution. All those in favor of authorizing the new shares and securing our future, raise your hands." Julian threw his own hand high into the air, a manic, victorious grin stretching across his face as he stared down the executives. Slowly, reluctantly, Arthur began to raise his trembling hand. Beside him, two other board members squeezed their eyes shut and began to lift their arms, ready to cement the massive corporate fraud. Just as their hands reached the air, a sound shattered the tense, claustrophobic atmosphere. The heavy oak and frosted glass doors of the boardroom violently swung open, slamming against the interior walls with a deafening explosive crash that completely cut the vote short. Chloe marched through the threshold, radiating an aura of absolute terrifying power. Gone was the accommodating, soft-spoken housewife who had spent the last 7 years packing school lunches and quietly managing Julian's domestic life from the shadows. She wore a razor-sharp, tailored midnight blue designer suit that commanded immediate, unquestionable respect. Her posture was flawless, her gaze lethal. She looked exactly like the apex predator this company had desperately needed, and the sheer force of her presence sucked the oxygen straight out of the room. She did not walk in alone. Flanking her on either side were 4 heavily armed private security contractors. Their tactical gear and grim, unyielding expressions formed a stark, intimidating contrast to the polished corporate surroundings. Right behind them marched 3 stone-faced investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission. They carried heavy titanium briefcases and wore the unmistakable detached authority of federal agents about to dismantle a multi-million-dollar fraud operation. They fanned out across the room with practiced military precision, instantly securing the exits and blocking the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, ensuring no one could slip out or destroy evidence. Julian leaped back from the black marble table as if the stone itself had suddenly caught fire. The manic, victorious grin he had worn just seconds ago melted into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He pointed a trembling, sweat-slicked finger at Chloe, spit flying from his lips as his voice cracked into a hysterical shriek. "Security! Get security up here right now! How did she get in the building? Get this crazy woman out of my boardroom! She is unhinged. She is having a psychotic break. Remove her immediately." Chloe did not flinch. She did not raise her voice to match his frantic, pathetic shouting. She simply ignored his existence entirely, walking with deliberate, measured steps down the length of the massive marble table. The terrified executives pressed their backs firmly against their leather chairs. They pulled their hands away from the voting buttons, as if the marble surface had become electrified, their eyes darting between Julian's meltdown and the federal agents securing the doors. Vanessa, standing paralyzed near the window, let out a sharp, pathetic gasp. She recognized the exact same cold, unyielding expression Chloe had worn in the courtroom just hours prior, the look of a woman who had already won the war before the first shot was even fired. Chloe stopped directly in front of Julian. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy and suffocating, broken only by Julian's ragged, panicked breathing. She looked down at him, her eyes dark and completely devoid of the warmth and patience he had exploited for nearly a decade. She placed her hands flat on the marble, perfectly mirroring the dominant stance Julian had tried to fake just moments ago, but she executed it with the effortless weight of true authority. "You do not own this room, Julian," Chloe stated, her voice slicing through the thick, tense air with surgical precision. "You do not own this company, and you certainly do not have the authority to initiate a fraudulent stock dilution to cover up your massive embezzlement. I am Vanguard Holdings. I am the 68% majority shareholder, and you are sitting in my chair." Julian tried to speak, but his throat seized. He looked wildly toward Arthur Penhaligon, silently begging the chief risk officer to intervene, to call the police, to do anything to validate the illusion of his power. But Arthur was not looking at Julian. Arthur was staring in absolute horror at the 3 federal agents who were currently pulling official warrants from their breast pockets. The lead SEC investigator, a tall, imposing woman with sharp features, stepped forward. She dropped a thick stack of federal subpoenas directly onto the center of the table. "We are with the Securities and Exchange Commission," she announced, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "We are executing an immediate total freeze on all corporate assets, data servers, and offshore holding accounts associated with Apex Artificial Intelligence. No one leaves this room until all personal and corporate devices are surrendered and cataloged." Before the shock could fully register with the terrified board, Marcus pushed his chair back and stood up. He walked calmly down the length of the table, pulling a sleek, encrypted hard drive from his suit pocket. Julian watched him, his eyes widening in a mixture of profound betrayal and disbelief, as Marcus stopped directly beside Chloe. "Here is the complete, unaltered digital ledger, Ms. Thorne," Marcus said, handing the drive to Chloe with a respectful nod. "It contains the exact timestamps, offshore routing numbers, and internal communication logs detailing every single fraudulent transaction Julian and Vanessa authorized over the last 4 fiscal quarters. It also includes the backdoor server registry Julian just attempted to use to illegally sell the mirrored source code to buyers in Dubai." Julian stumbled backward, his shoulders hitting the thick glass wall overlooking the city. "Marcus, you cannot do this," he pleaded, his voice dropping into a desperate, pathetic whine. "You are family. Maya will never forgive you for destroying her brother." Marcus adjusted his tie, his expression entirely devoid of sympathy. "Maya is the one who drove me to Chloe's hotel last night, Julian. She provided the encrypted passwords to your personal accounts. She is currently packing her bags and moving out of your mother's estate. She chose the truth. You chose to be a thief." The reality of the situation crashed over the boardroom like an avalanche. The executives' men, who had just been seconds away from raising their hands to commit federal securities fraud at Julian's violent urging, finally understood exactly who they were dealing with. Chloe was not a hysterical, discarded wife fighting a bitter custody battle. She was the brilliant architect of their entire corporate infrastructure, the true power behind the throne, and she now held the absolute legal authority to send every single one of them to federal prison for their complicity. Arthur Penhaligon was the first to move. He practically shoved his heavy leather chair out of the way, scrambling backward and physically distancing himself from Julian. The rest of the board immediately followed suit. They abandoned their tablets, their coffee cups, and any lingering shred of loyalty to their fake CEO. They rushed toward the opposite end of the room, tripping over each other in a desperate, frantic scramble to put as much space between themselves and Julian as physically possible, leaving him entirely isolated and exposed. Julian stood entirely alone at the far end of the marble expanse. He violently jerked the lapels of his custom suit jacket, attempting to physically reassemble his shattered authority. A harsh, barking laugh erupted from his throat, echoing off the glass walls. He pointed a dismissive finger at the federal agents. "You are making a catastrophic jurisdictional error," Julian sneered, his voice pitching high with desperate bravado. "That woman is my estranged wife. She is currently embroiled in a bitter, highly contested divorce and custody battle. That digital drive is nothing but a collection of fabricated, manipulated spreadsheets designed to extort a larger settlement. My financial ledgers are absolutely pristine." Chloe did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She simply watched Julian rage with the clinical, detached fascination of a scientist observing a dying insect. His screaming echoed off the glass, a pathetic, desperate sound that only amplified his absolute powerlessness. When his chest began to heave and his shouts dissolved into ragged, breathless gasps, Chloe finally moved. She offered a single, precise flick of her wrist toward the back of the room. From the shadow of the federal agent stepped a tall, impeccably dressed corporate litigator. He bypassed the terrified board members, walked directly to the boardroom's central media console, and inserted a biometric security key. Instantly, the smart glass wall behind Julian shifted from a panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline into a glaringly bright digital projector screen. A sharply scanned, highly detailed legal document illuminated the entire room. Julian spun around to face the screen, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal text. He squinted at the bottom of the page where his own signature sat stark and undeniable in black ink. "You wrote the code, Julian," Chloe stated, her voice slicing through the heavy silence with lethal clarity. "That is a fact. But you did not own the servers to train it. You did not have the capital to scale it. 7 years ago, you were 27 years old and completely bankrupt. You were facing eviction, drowning in unsecured loans, and your previous startup had just collapsed into a humiliating, spectacular failure. You came to me begging for a lifeline." Julian opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. He stared at the screen, the memories of his own desperation crashing into his manufactured reality. "I gave you that lifeline," Chloe continued, rising slowly from her chair to command the absolute center of attention. "Vanguard Holdings provided the seed capital to keep your algorithms alive. We paid your rent, we bought your servers, and we funded the initial deployment. But I am not a charity, Julian. I am an investor. And in exchange for saving your life, you signed that document." Chloe pointed directly at the illuminated projection. The corporate litigator tapped a command on the console, highlighting a specific, boldly printed paragraph in the center of the contract. "Read it aloud, Julian." Chloe demanded, her tone shifting from corporate executive to absolute dictator. "Read the intellectual property clause to your board of directors." Julian remained frozen, his jaw trembling. Arthur Penhaligon, eager to prove his newfound loyalty to the true majority shareholder, leaned forward and read the highlighted text for the entire room to hear. "Pursuant to the terms of this initial funding agreement, Vanguard Holdings retains 100% exclusive ownership of all intellectual property source code, algorithmic architecture, and subsequent iterations developed by the founder in perpetuity." The board members let out a collective synchronized gasp. They had been lied to since the day Apex AI went public. They had invested millions under the assumption that Julian held the patents. Instead, they had been pouring their wealth into a company completely owned and controlled by the woman sitting at the head of the table. "You signed away your kingdom before you even built the castle," Chloe explained, her gaze stripping Julian of his remaining dignity. "Every single line of code you wrote, every update you patched, and every product you launched legally belongs to Vanguard Holdings. You are not a titan of industry. You are simply an employee. You are a highly paid contractor who has just been terminated for cause." Julian gripped his hair, his perfect grooming ruined, as he spiraled into total denial. "No!" he shouted, his voice cracking into a high, desperate register. "The IPO superseded that agreement. My lawyers reviewed the corporate transition. I have founder protections. I am the chief executive officer." "You were the chief executive officer," Chloe corrected smoothly. "And your founder protections were entirely contingent on your compliance with the primary operating agreement." She gestured to the litigator, who tapped the console again. The projection shifted, bringing up a heavily annotated subsection labeled 4B, the morality clause. Chloe announced, letting the words hang in the air like a guillotine. "A standard inclusion for high-risk investments. It clearly states that any utilization of corporate resources to fund illegal activities, engage in financial embezzlement, or maintain a shadow lifestyle to finance an illicit affair immediately triggers a total forfeiture of all executive privileges." Chloe walked around the massive marble table, stopping just inches from Julian. She looked up into his panicked, bloodshot eyes. "You used my company's research and development budget to buy a $12 million mansion for your mistress," Chloe stated, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm whisper. "You used Vanguard assets to settle your gambling debts. You breached the morality clause 100 times over. You triggered the forfeiture perfectly. You own nothing, Julian. You do not own the code. You do not own the company. You do not even own the suit you are wearing because the Vanguard corporate card paid for the tailoring. You are completely, legally, and financially erased." Julian collapsed backward into the leather chair, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight. He stared blankly at the polished marble table, his mind fracturing as the absolute reality of his situation set in. He was entirely stripped of his title, his wealth, and his manufactured identity. He was a ruined man facing decades in a federal penitentiary, and he had handed his executioner the very weapon she used to destroy him. While Julian stared into the abyss of his own making, the room's attention remained entirely fixed on Chloe. No one noticed the subtle, desperate movement near the floor-to-ceiling windows. Vanessa had watched the entire intellectual property takedown with cold, calculating horror. The promised billions from the Dubai buyers were gone. The Malibu mansion would be seized by the SEC within the hour. Julian was no longer a golden ticket to the elite social circles she craved. He was a massive radioactive liability. She needed to sever her ties immediately. Vanessa slowly backed away from the glass walls, using the shocked board members as a visual shield. She moved with agonizing caution, her eyes locked on the heavy oak doors leading to the executive hallway. She knew the SEC agents were focused on securing Julian's corporate devices. If she could just reach the private stairwell, she could disappear into the Manhattan crowds, access her emergency offshore accounts, and vanish before the federal indictments were officially handed down. She reached the back of the room, her hand hovering just inches above the cool brass door handle. She took a silent, shallow breath, preparing to slip out of the corporate slaughterhouse. Chloe did not even turn her head. She kept her eyes locked on Julian's defeated posture, maintaining her absolute dominance over the room. But as Vanessa's fingers brushed the brass handle, Chloe raised her right hand into the air and snapped her fingers. The sharp cracking sound echoed through the silent boardroom. Instantly, the heavy oak doors swung violently inward, hitting Vanessa squarely in the shoulder and knocking her back onto the carpet. Waiting in the executive hallway was not an empty escape route, but a specialized team of federal marshals holding a thick stack of sealed indictments. The heavy oak door rebounding off Vanessa's shoulder sent her sprawling backward onto the plush carpet. She scrambled frantically, her expensive heels catching in the fabric as she looked up at the imposing figures currently blocking her only exit. 4 federal marshals stepped over the threshold, their dark tactical vests and utility belts a sharp, violent contrast to the pristine, opulent corporate backdrop of Apex AI. The lead marshal, a broad-shouldered man with a gaze like chipped ice, stepped directly over Vanessa's dropped designer handbag. He did not look at Julian. He did not glance at the terrified board members pressed against the far wall. His eyes were locked entirely unblinkingly on the woman scrambling to her feet. Julian flinched at the center of the room, instinctively raising his hands and bracing his body against the marble table. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the cold steel cuffs, waiting for the inevitable end to his fabricated empire. He expected the federal agents to swarm him to drag the disgraced CEO out in front of his entire board of directors. But the heavy, synchronized footsteps bypassed him completely. The marshals marched right past the self-proclaimed creator of the company, treating Julian like a piece of irrelevant office furniture. They formed a tight, inescapable semicircle around Vanessa, effectively trapping her against the edge of the mahogany table. "Vanessa Thorne, you are under arrest by order of the United States Department of Justice." The lead marshal stated, his voice a booming baritone that left absolutely no room for negotiation or argument. He reached for his belt, the metallic clink of handcuffs echoing sharply through the dead-silent room. "You are being charged with 3 counts of corporate financial fraud, 5 counts of aggravated wire fraud, and conspiracy to embezzle federal assets. You have the right to remain silent." The marshal continued reciting the Miranda rights with practiced mechanical efficiency as 2 deputies moved in to flank her sides. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand the rights I have just read to you?" The pristine, arrogant mask Vanessa had meticulously maintained for the entirety of her corporate tenure dissolved in a matter of seconds. Her jaw trembled violently. The blood drained completely from her face, leaving her pale, sickly, and visibly shaking. "This is a massive mistake," she gasped, her voice pitching into a shrill, breathless panic that completely destroyed her carefully cultivated public relations persona. I am the director of marketing. I handle press releases. I do not touch the corporate finances. You want him?" She pointed a frantic manicured finger directly at Julian, throwing her lover under the bus without a fraction of a second of hesitation. "He controls the offshore accounts. He authorized the transfers to Malibu. I just do what he tells me to do. He is the CEO. I am just an employee." "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the marshal ordered, completely ignoring her desperate, pathetic plea. When she hesitated, frozen in absolute terror, a female deputy stepped forward, firmly grabbing Vanessa's wrist and spinning her around. The sharp, unmistakable sound of steel ratchets locking into place echoed loudly across the penthouse. Vanessa's wrists were bound tightly behind her back, the cold metal digging into her skin, completely severing her from the life of untouchable luxury she had stolen. The physical reality of the handcuffs broke whatever remained of her denial. The reality of federal prison slammed into her with the force of a freight train. Vanessa collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. The expensive makeup she had carefully applied that morning ran down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. She twisted her head, looking desperately toward the center of the room. "Julian!" she shrieked, her voice cracking and echoing off the panoramic glass walls. "Julian! Tell them! Tell them! It was your idea! Tell them I had no access to the Vanguard ledgers! Call your lawyers! Call the crisis fixers! Do something! You promised me we were untouchable! You promised me Dubai!" Julian remained glued to his leather chair, absolutely paralyzed by his own cowardice. His breathing was shallow and erratic. He stared at Vanessa, the woman he had risked his entire family legacy to impress the woman he had destroyed his marriage for, and he offered her absolutely nothing. He did not call his highly paid legal team. He did not shout executive demands. He did not take the blame to save her. He just sat there, a hollow, broken shell of a man, terrified that making a single sound would draw the federal agent's attention back to him. His silence was the ultimate spineless betrayal. The board of directors watched the scene unfold in stunned, breathless silence. These were men who had been bullied, threatened, and manipulated by Vanessa for years. They had endured her arrogant lectures, her condescending emails, and her aggressive push to dilute their shares and steal their pensions. Now they stood pressed against the far wall, watching the untouchable PR director weep like an abandoned child on the boardroom floor. Her career was completely destroyed. Her social standing was permanently erased. Her future consisted entirely of federal courtrooms, asset seizures, and a concrete prison cell. "Get her up the lead," Marshall instructed, his tone devoid of any sympathy. The deputies hoisted Vanessa to her feet, ignoring her protests. She continued to thrash and sob, her designer heels dragging awkwardly across the plush corporate carpet. She screamed Julian's name one final time, a guttural sound of pure hatred and despair, as the agents marched her firmly toward the exit. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, instantly cutting off her hysterical cries and leaving the boardroom bathed in an eerie, profound silence. The federal storm had swept through the penthouse, claiming its first major casualty, and the room felt instantly lighter, finally purged of her toxic, manipulative presence. Chloe remained seated at the head of the marble table, her posture perfectly straight, her hands resting calmly on the polished stone surface. She had not blinked during the arrest. She had not gloated or smiled. She had simply watched the surgical removal of the woman who had tried to destroy her family with the detached clinical satisfaction of a general watching a successful tactical strike. Slowly, methodically, Chloe turned her cold, predatory gaze back to Julian, preparing to deliver the final financial blow. The relentless, freezing rain of a gray Manhattan morning lashed against the towering glass facade of Vanguard Holdings. Inside the cavernous minimalist lobby, the temperature was strictly regulated to a comfortable warmth, yet Julian and Beatrice Thorne stood shivering violently near the security turnstiles. Their designer clothes, usually a flawless armor of intimidation, were thoroughly soaked and clinging awkwardly to their skin. Beatrice's pristine blowout was completely ruined, wet silver strands plastered across her pale, gaunt face. Julian looked significantly worse. The former golden boy, the supposed titan of the artificial intelligence industry, stood with his shoulders slumped, his custom Italian suit saturated with rainwater and street grime. They had spent the entire night bouncing between the couches of reluctant acquaintances who suddenly remembered urgent out-of-town travel the second the federal indictments hit the news cycle. The elite social circle they had so ruthlessly cultivated had closed its doors permanently. Now they were just two desperate trespassers trying to bypass a security desk that explicitly denied them entry. The head of Vanguard Security, a towering man who recognized Julian immediately but felt absolutely zero inclination to help him, crossed his arms over his chest. He calmly informed the disgraced duo that their biometric profiles had been purged from the global system. Beatrice attempted her usual aristocratic sneer, demanding to speak to a manager, but her voice lacked its usual venom. It shook with cold and unadulterated terror. She threatened to call the police, to which the security chief politely offered to dial the precinct for her, casually mentioning that the federal marshals might want to know their exact location to serve additional warrants. Julian grabbed his mother's arm, pulling her back from the desk. He was completely defeated, hollowed out by the reality of his own catastrophic actions. They had nowhere else to go. They stood huddled near a large, cold marble pillar, reduced to waiting in the lobby like vagrants hoping for a glimpse of the building's true owner. The polished steel elevator doors chimed and slid open. Chloe stepped out into the lobby. She moved with effortless grace, holding a steaming cup of artisan coffee. She wore a tailored ivory pantsuit that projected absolute power and unbothered calm. She was reviewing a digital tablet flanked by two sharp-looking executive assistants who were hanging on to her every word regarding the Apex AI corporate restructuring and the transition of assets. Chloe did not look tired. She did not look vengeful. She looked completely, utterly serene, like a woman who had finally excised a malignant tumor from her life and was enjoying her first morning of perfect health. She walked toward the main exit, completely ignoring the two soaked figures shivering by the marble pillar. Beatrice saw her. The matriarch who had spent the last decade mocking Chloe's background, criticizing her manners, and demanding absolute subservience, broke completely. The crushing weight of impending poverty and total social exile obliterated her lifelong arrogant pride. Chloe Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the cavernous lobby. "Chloe, please wait." Chloe paused, not out of shock, but out of mild annoyance, as if a stray pigeon had wandered into her pristine building. Beatrice broke away from Julian and rushed forward. Her wet designer heels slipped on the polished marble floor, and she literally collapsed at Chloe's feet. The elite socialite dropped heavily to her knees, her hands grasping wildly at the air just inches from Chloe's immaculate ivory trousers, terrified to actually touch her. "Chloe, please, you have to stop this," Beatrice sobbed, her chest heaving with hysterical, ugly gasps. "You cannot let the federal agents take my son. You cannot let them take our ancestral home. We are family. We have 10 years of family ties. You cannot simply erase a decade of shared history. I was harsh on you. I know I was. But it was only because I wanted you to be strong. Please, I am begging you on my knees. Drop the federal charges. Call off the SEC." Julian stumbled forward, joining his mother on the lobby floor. The man who had strutted through boardrooms screaming about his intellectual dominance now looked like a terrified, beaten child. He fell to his knees beside Beatrice, tears freely mixing with the rainwater on his face. The tech billionaire was completely gone, replaced by a coward facing the immediate reality of a concrete cell. "Chloe, I am so sorry." Julian mumbled, his voice a pathetic, broken whimper that echoed through the quiet space. "I was stupid. I was weak. Vanessa manipulated me. She got into my head and made me think I deserved more. She orchestrated the offshore accounts. I never meant to hurt you, I swear to God. I will give you whatever you want. I will sign whatever papers you need me to sign. Just tell the SEC to back off. Please, Chloe, I cannot go to federal prison. They will destroy me in there. I would not survive it. I will change. I promise you, I will be the husband you always wanted. Just give me one more chance to prove it. The Vanguard employees traversing the lobby slowed their pace, stopping to watch the bizarre, pathetic spectacle of the former billionaire and his aristocratic mother groveling on the wet floor. The security chief stepped forward, raising a hand to signal his tactical team to physically remove the trespassers from the building. Chloe held up a single, perfectly manicured finger, stopping the guards instantly. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee. She looked down at Beatrice's ruined, wet hair and Julian's tear-streaked, desperate face. She did not raise her voice. She did not display a single ounce of rage, satisfaction, or pity. Chloe stopped looking down at the people who had made her life miserable for 10 years, her face perfectly composed. Chloe stopped looking down at the people who had made her life miserable for 10 years, her face perfectly composed. She stood like a marble statue amidst the chaotic desperation of the Vanguard lobby. She looked at the tear-streaked faces of the people who had dedicated a decade to destroying her self-worth. She did not see a mother-in-law. She did not see a husband. She saw two strangers experiencing the natural, unyielding consequences of their own spectacular arrogance. Beatrice reached out again, her trembling fingers hovering mere inches from Chloe's pristine shoes. "Please, Chloe, we are family. You have to remember the good times." Chloe took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee. The rich, dark aroma filled the space between them, a sharp contrast to the smell of damp wool and raw fear radiating from Beatrice. "Family." Chloe repeated the word, snapping like a physical whip across the quiet, cavernous lobby. "You use that word only when you are cornered, Beatrice. For 10 years, I was the help. I was the placeholder. I was the convenient, quiet scapegoat for every single one of Julian's failures and your insatiable spending habits. Do not dare invoke family ties now. Family ties are not a currency you can spend to cover up federal felonies." Julian scrambled forward on his knees, his hands clasped together in a pathetic, desperate prayer. His expensive Italian suit was ruined, his hair plastered to his forehead. "I will sign the divorce papers today," he pleaded, his voice breaking into an ugly, wet sob. "I will walk away from Vanguard with absolutely nothing. Just call the SEC. You have the power, Chloe. You have all the leverage. You can make this go away." Chloe looked at the man she had once promised to spend her life with. There was no love left in her heart, no anger, not even a lingering spark of resentment. There was only a profound clinical disgust. "Do you remember my birthday, Julian?" she asked, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register that forced him to stop sobbing and listen. "Do you remember standing in our living room surrounded by your arrogant friends while Vanessa systematically humiliated me? Do you remember what you told me when I pulled you aside and begged for your support?" Julian flinched, the memory clearly striking him with the force of a physical blow. He opened his mouth, desperately searching for a lie, an excuse, a way to spin his past cruelty, but he could not formulate a single coherent sentence. "You told me I was being overly sensitive," Chloe stated, her gaze locking onto his terrified, bloodshot eyes. "You told me to accept it or get out. Or get—" She took one calculated step back, putting a definitive physical distance between herself and the wreckage of her past. "Those are my exact terms for you today, Julian. The federal indictments are coming. The asset seizures are completely final. The life you stole is over. Accept it or get out." Behind Chloe, the polished steel doors of a second executive elevator slid open with a soft, melodic chime. Marcus stepped out into the lobby, his presence immediately commanding the attention of the security detail. He was followed closely by Maya. Beatrice's head snapped up at the sound of her daughter's footsteps. A fresh wave of desperate, delusional hope washed over the older woman's tear-stained face. Beatrice cried out, scrambling to adjust her ruined posture, trying to summon the matriarchal authority that had vanished hours ago. "Oh, thank God." "Maya, darling, talk to your brother. Talk to Marcus. You have to make them see reason. We are being destroyed. They are leaving us with nothing." Maya stopped dead in her tracks. She looked down at her mother and brother groveling on the wet marble floor. There was no pity in her eyes. There was no familial warmth or instinct to protect them. There was only a deep, visceral revulsion. Maya crossed her arms, her posture perfectly mirroring Chloe's unbothered absolute authority. "I warned you," Maya said, her voice completely devoid of the deferential tone she had used her entire life. "I warned both of you for years that your greed and your cruelty would eventually catch up with you. You treated Chloe like garbage. You treated me like a pawn. You built an entire empire on lies, financial fraud, and manipulation, and you expected me to just smile and pose for the family portraits while you destroyed people." "Maya, please," Julian begged, extending a shaking hand toward his sister. "We need your help. You are a thorn. You do not need help, Julian." Maya retorted instantly, her voice cold as ice. "You need a good defense attorney, and since you cannot afford one, I suggest you start practicing your public defender requests. Marcus and I are leaving for London tonight. We are expanding the Vanguard European division, and we are leaving this toxic wasteland behind." Maya looked directly at Beatrice, her gaze unwavering as she severed the final toxic thread that bound them. "You will never manipulate me again, Mother. You will never use my name to secure another line of credit or bolster your failing social standing. As of this exact moment, you and Julian are officially cut off. Do not call me. Do not attempt to visit me. You are dead to me, too." Beatrice let out a guttural, wounded wail, collapsing completely onto the wet floor. Julian buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. The reality of their total isolation had finally penetrated their delusions. They had burned every bridge, betrayed every ally, and alienated the only family members who possessed the resources to save them. Chloe did not offer a single word of comfort. She simply turned her back on them, walking smoothly toward her waiting private elevator alongside Marcus and Maya. As the doors slid open to grant Chloe entry, she gave a brief, subtle nod to the towering security chief standing near the desk. The head of security immediately stepped forward, signaling his tactical team. 4 heavily built guards marched over, grabbing Julian and Beatrice by their soaked arms. They hauled the weeping mother and son off the pristine marble floor, ignoring their shrieks and desperate pleas, dragging them roughly toward the revolving glass doors. Chloe stepped into the elevator, turning around just in time to watch the security team physically shove Julian and Beatrice out into the freezing, relentless Manhattan rain. The heavy glass doors sealed shut, locking the Thorne family out of the Vanguard Empire forever. 6 months passed, sweeping away the wreckage of the Apex artificial intelligence scandal and leaving a radically altered corporate landscape in its wake. The domino effect of Julian's arrest had triggered a spectacular chain of events, completely reshaping the lives of everyone involved. The evening news broadcasts served as the final public obituary for the Thorne family legacy. Across the country, glowing television screens illuminated living rooms with the exact same breaking headline. A polished anchor looked directly into the camera, her tone a mixture of professional detachment and barely concealed fascination. Former Apex AI Chief Executive Officer Julian Thorne was sentenced today to 5 years in federal prison. The anchor announced as a split screen displayed a courtroom sketch of a visibly gaunt, hollowed-out Julian. Thorne pleaded guilty to multiple counts of corporate fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy, concluding a spectacular fall from grace for the once celebrated tech billionaire. Julian's reality had shrunk from a sprawling glass-walled penthouse overlooking Manhattan to a sterile 8x10 concrete cell in a federal penitentiary. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly overhead, providing a constant, maddening reminder of his utter powerlessness. There were no sycophantic board members left to stroke his fragile ego, no expensive tailored suits to project his fabricated authority, and absolutely no access to the offshore wealth he had so arrogantly assumed was untouchable. His daily routine now consisted of rigid head counts, awful institutional food, and the crushing, inescapable silence of his own spectacular failure. He had eagerly traded his entire future for a fleeting illusion of dominance, and the federal justice system had mercilessly collected the debt. Vanessa suffered a similarly absolute obliteration. The woman who had proudly orchestrated Chloe's public humiliation at the birthday party now found herself entirely blacklisted from the corporate world. The federal indictment had severed her from every single elite connection she had ruthlessly cultivated over the past decade. When the aggressive asset seizures drained her accounts dry, Vanessa was forced to officially file for bankruptcy. The humiliation was absolute and highly public. Her luxury vehicles were repossessed in broad daylight. Her carefully curated public relations firm dropped her as a client, actively scrubbing her name from their website within hours of her arrest. She was reduced to haggling with high-end consignment shops, desperately selling off her collection of designer handbags and diamond jewelry just to afford the retainer for a bargain-tier defense attorney. The irony was suffocating. The woman who had once dictated the social hierarchy of New York's elite was now functionally invisible, a toxic pariah forever marked by the scandal she had eagerly helped engineer. But perhaps the most poetic justice was reserved for Beatrice. The Thorne family matriarch had built her entire identity on a foundation of generational wealth and aristocratic superiority. She had spent a decade treating Chloe like an uncultured peasant, wielding her money and her ancestral mansion as heavy weapons of intimidation. Now that foundation was completely pulverized. With Julian's assets frozen and the SEC aggressively clawing back the misappropriated funds, Beatrice's heavily leveraged estate collapsed like a delicate house of cards. The bank rapidly foreclosed on the sprawling Connecticut mansion. The agonizing, highly publicized estate sale stripped away her priceless antiques, her inherited art collection, and the antique silver she had so proudly polished. Beatrice was forced to move into a tiny, cramped one-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. The space was suffocatingly small, constantly smelling of old paint and cheap linoleum. The apartment was a physical manifestation of her failure. Every time she bumped into the cramped kitchen counter or heard her neighbors arguing through the paper-thin walls, she was reminded of the empire she had lost. There was no household staff to bring her morning tea. There was no grand dining room to host her exclusive social events. Her bridge club friends immediately blocked her number, treating the Thorne name like a highly contagious disease. Beatrice spent her days sitting in a cheap armchair, staring at the peeling wallpaper, utterly consumed by the realization that her own blinding arrogance had orchestrated her absolute ruin. She had demanded unquestioning loyalty to the Thorne legacy, and in doing so, she had destroyed it entirely. Thousands of miles away, completely removed from the suffocating despair of her former abusers, Chloe sat in the opulent silence of a private first-class cabin. The massive commercial aircraft was cruising smoothly at 40,000 feet, racing high over the Pacific Ocean toward Tokyo. The cabin was a masterclass in elite luxury, featuring sliding privacy doors, plush leather seating, and ambient lighting that adjusted seamlessly to the changing time zones. Beside her, little Leo was curled up under a thick cashmere blanket. He was sleeping soundly, his chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. A small plush toy was tucked securely under his arm. There were no shouting matches to wake him up. There was no toxic tension radiating through the walls of a cold mansion. He was safe, secure, and completely oblivious to the chaos that had been surgically removed from his life. Chloe adjusted the reading light above her seat and turned her attention back to the sleek digital tablet resting on her tray table. The screen displayed the finalized blueprints and financial projections for Apex AI's new global expansion initiative. The numbers were staggering, representing a multi-billion-dollar venture that would solidify the company's absolute dominance in the Asian markets. Across the wide aisle, Marcus was leaning forward in his own luxurious suite, reviewing a matching set of documents. As the newly appointed Chief Financial Officer of Apex AI, Marcus had proven to be an invaluable asset. He possessed the exact brand of ruthless efficiency and financial brilliance that Julian had always lacked. He tapped his stylus against his screen, highlighting a specific merger clause. The Japanese Regulatory Board has pre-approved the server acquisitions, Marcus said quietly, careful not to wake the sleeping child. If we authorize the initial capital transfer by Tuesday, We will absolutely dominate the sector before the regional competitors even realize we have established a footprint. The projected revenue stream will effectively double Vanguard's valuation within the fiscal year. Chloe reviewed the highlighted clause, her analytical mind instantly processing the massive tactical advantage. Authorize it, she instructed, her voice calm and highly decisive. I want the Tokyo headquarters fully operational by the end of the quarter. Marcus smiled, a genuine expression of professional respect. Consider it done. Chloe set the tablet down and leaned back into the plush leather seat. She turned her head and looked out the oval window. The horizon was just beginning to glow with the vibrant, fiery colors of a new dawn. Brilliant streaks of gold and violet pierced the deep blue atmosphere, chasing away the darkness of the long night. She watched the sunrise with a profound, unshakable sense of peace. She had not screamed. She had not thrown tantrums or begged for basic human validation. She had simply assessed the battlefield, gathered her leverage, and systematically dismantled the toxic forces that had tried to suffocate her. She had weaponized their own arrogance against them, letting their overwhelming greed become the exact instrument of their destruction. The Thorne family had believed they held all the power because they controlled the volume of the conversation. But Chloe had proven that true absolute power did not require shouting. It required patience, intellect, and the willingness to strike only when the victory was mathematically guaranteed. She looked at her sleeping son, then back at the boundless, illuminated horizon stretching out before her. She was the sole architect of her empire, the undisputed master of her own fate, and she was finally completely free. The story of Chloe and Julian powerfully illustrates that true success cannot be built on a foundation of deceit, entitlement, or the exploitation of others. Julian and Beatrice constructed an empire fueled by stolen brilliance and unearned arrogance, believing they were permanently untouchable. However, their ultimate downfall proves that accountability is inevitable. When you treat people as disposable stepping stones, you inevitably burn the bridges you might one day need to survive. Authentic power comes from integrity, resilience, and hard work, not manipulation. Always treat others with respect, because arrogance eventually leads to total ruin. Share your thoughts on this lesson and comment below.